Welcome to the channel Urban Nightmares. Now you're going to hear the story of haunted dolls. I don't know why I chose that motel. Maybe it was the exhaustion from driving all day, or maybe it was something else, something that tugged at the frayed edges of my sanity. The sun was setting when I pulled off the highway, the sky a bruised purple, and the air thick with the promise of rain. I was far from any major city, somewhere in the bowels of the countryside, where the roads wound like serpents through dark forests and fields that stretched endlessly into nothingness. I hadn't seen another car for miles. There it was, the Doll's Inn. The neon sign flickered weakly in the twilight, casting an eerie, pale glow over the gravel parking lot. There was something unsettling about the place, a feeling that settled deep in my gut the moment I saw it. It was the kind of motel that had seen better days, perhaps decades ago. The paint was peeling from the walls and the windows were dark, like empty eye sockets. But I was tired, too tired to care about anything but a bed and a few hours of sleep. I parked my car and made my way to the front desk. The lobby was dimly lit, cluttered with old, mismatched furniture that reeked of mildew. A faint smell of dust and something else, something sweet and sickly, hung in the air. There was no one at the desk, just a small bell, which I rang hesitantly. The sound echoed in the stillness, unnaturally loud. A door creaked open behind the desk and out shuffled the woman who would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. She was ancient, her skin a network of wrinkles that seemed to barely hold together. Her hair was white and thin, pulled back into a tight bun that only emphasized the sharpness of her features. But it was her eyes that unnerved me the most, black, beady, and glittering with a strange intensity, as if they could see straight through me, right into my soul. "How can I help you, young man?" she asked, her voice a raspy whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of myself. "I need a room for the night," I replied in my broken Spanish, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course," she said, reaching under the counter to retrieve a key. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed it to me. The key was old, the metal cold against my palm. "Room number 7. She didn't ask for payment, and I didn't offer it. I just wanted to get to the room, to put some distance between myself and those eyes. "Do you need anything else, young man?" she asked, her voice dripping with something that felt like malice, though I couldn't be sure. "No," I muttered, turning away from her gaze as quickly as I could. As I headed down the hallway, I could feel her watching me. The sensation made my skin crawl. The corridor was narrow and dimly lit, the walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper that might have been floral once but now looked more like a series of strange, abstract patterns. The floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked, the wood protesting with every step. When I reached room 7, I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door. Something about this place felt deeply wrong, but exhaustion clouded my thoughts. I was beyond rationality, beyond logic. I just needed to sleep. The room was small and musty, with a single bed covered in a faded floral bedspread. There was a dresser against one wall, an old-fashioned vanity with a cracked mirror against another. The air was thick and oppressive, the kind of stale air that had been trapped for years. I shivered involuntarily, but it was the dolls that stopped me in my tracks. They were everywhere, lined up on the dresser, perched on the vanity, sitting in the corners of the room. All of them were old, with porcelain faces that were chipped and cracked, their eyes wide open, unblinking as if they were watching me. There must have been at least 24 of them, all different sizes and styles, dressed in faded, antiquated clothing. Their faces were eerily lifelike, yet frozen in expressions that ranged from serene to sinister. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that the old woman who ran the place probably had some strange obsession with dolls, but it didn't help. The sight of them filled me with an inexplicable dread, a fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to move, to cross the room and set my bag down on the bed. The mattress creaked under the weight, the springs groaning as if in pain. I tried to ignore the feeling of 100 tiny eyes on me as I changed into something more comfortable for the night. I could feel my pulse quicken, my skin prickle with unease. I hadn't felt this way in years, this creeping, insidious fear that whispered in my ear, telling me to leave, to get out while I still could. But where would I go? I was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of dark forest, with no other options for miles. I shook my head, trying to dispel the irrational thoughts. "It's just a room," I muttered to myself. "Just a stupid room with some stupid dolls. You're being ridiculous." But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the fear wouldn't leave me. I lay down on the bed, pulling the covers over me in a futile attempt to feel safe. The springs dug into my back, making it impossible to get comfortable. I closed my eyes, but the darkness behind my eyelids was filled with images of those dolls, their glassy eyes staring at me, their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how long I lay there, teetering on the edge of sleep before it happened. A soft rustling sound, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. My eyes snapped open and I strained to hear it again. The room was silent, save for the faint ticking of an old clock somewhere in the distance. But then I heard it again, this time closer. The dolls hadn't moved. Of course they hadn't. They were just toys, just inanimate objects that couldn't move on their own. But still the fear gnawed at me, relentless and insistent. I told myself it was nothing. I was tired, my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, louder this time. A soft, scraping sound, like something sliding across the floor. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The dolls were exactly where they had been when I'd first walked in, their positions unchanged. But the fear only grew stronger, wrapping around my chest like a vice. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet hitting the cold wooden floor. The air felt colder now, the oppressive atmosphere even more suffocating. I couldn't stay in this room. I had to get out, to leave this place before I lost my mind. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, not even bothering to change out of my pajamas. I needed to leave to escape this nightmare, but as I reached for the doorknob, I felt a presence behind me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, my breath hitching in my throat. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was there, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly I turned, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The dolls were still where I had left them, but something was different now. Their eyes, those cold, glassy eyes, seemed to be fixed on me, their unblinking gazes following my every movement. It was as if they were alive, aware, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. One of them, a large doll with curly brown hair and a blue dress, was no longer sitting on the vanity. It was now on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it had been thrown or pushed. But I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. I backed away, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob again. This time, when I pulled it open, I was met with the sight of the old woman standing in the hallway, her expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, young man?" she asked, her voice even quieter than before, almost a whisper. I couldn't speak, my throat too tight with fear. I just nodded, trying to force a smile that felt more like a grimace. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she looked past me into the room. "They don't like being left alone at night," she said, her voice soft, but laced with something that made my skin crawl. "The dolls, I mean, they don't like to be alone." I stared at her, not understanding what she meant, but too frightened to ask. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. "It's better if you stay with them," she continued, her voice taking on a strange, almost soothing tone. "You wouldn't want them to feel abandoned." Without waiting for my response, she turned and walked back down the hallway, leaving me standing there, frozen in place. The air felt heavy, thick with the stench of decay and something else, something darker, more sinister. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't stay here, not another second. I had to leave no matter what. But when I turned back to the room, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The dolls had moved. They were no longer sitting or standing in their previous positions. Instead, they were all facing the door, their eyes fixed on me with a terrifying intensity. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with fear and disbelief. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the evidence was right in front of me. They were alive. I bolted for the door, my hand fumbling with the lock in my panic. But before I could turn the knob, the door swung open on its own, revealing the old woman standing there once again, her face twisted into a cruel smile. "It's too late to leave," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "They've already chosen you." Before I could react, she stepped forward, shoving me back into the room with surprising strength. I stumbled and fell to the floor, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, she was standing over me, her smile growing wider, more twisted. "They're always looking for someone new," she said, her voice a sing-song now. "Someone to stay with them forever." I tried to crawl away, but my body wouldn't respond. I could only watch in horror as the dolls began to move, their tiny limbs creaking as they turned to face me. Their eyes, those cold, dead eyes, seemed to glow with a malevolent light, and I could feel their presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. The old woman reached down and grabbed my arm, her grip cold and unyielding. She dragged me toward the bed where the largest doll, the one with the blue dress, was now standing, its head tilted at that same unnatural angle. "She wants you," the old woman hissed, her breath hot against my ear. "She wants you to stay with her forever." I struggled, tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body felt like it was being crushed under an invisible weight, my mind fracturing under the terror that consumed me. And then, as if in a dream, I felt myself being lifted, my body hovering above the bed. The dolls watched in silence, their eyes gleaming with an unholy light. I could feel their presence, their thoughts invading my mind, whispering to me in a language I couldn't understand. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the old woman's voice, soft and mocking, as she whispered in my ear, "Welcome home." When I woke up, I was no longer in the room. I was standing in the middle of a field, the sun shining brightly overhead. The motel was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of grass and trees. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the familiar skin and bones, but instead I saw porcelain, smooth, cold, and flawless. I tried to move, to speak, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, my limbs stiff and unyielding. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own body, unable to scream, unable to cry for help. And then I realized the truth, the horrifying truth that shattered what little sanity I had left. I was one of them now. End of story. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now you're going to hear the story of breathing in the dark. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or the supernatural. I've always considered myself a rational person, someone who looks for logical explanations for things. But what happened to me on that cold October night has left me questioning everything I thought I knew. Maybe telling this story will help me make sense of it, or maybe it will just drive me deeper into the madness that has been gnawing at my mind ever since. Either way, I need to tell it, to get it out of my head. It all began with a road trip. I was driving from Richmond to Blacksburg, a trip I'd made a dozen times before. I was a graduate student at Virginia Tech, and I'd spent the weekend in Richmond visiting my parents. The plan was to head back on Sunday evening, giving me plenty of time to settle in before classes resumed on Monday. But as fate would have it, I got a late start. By the time I left, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, and the winding mountain roads would soon be shrouded in darkness. As I drove, my thoughts were a jumbled mess. The breakup with Sarah was still fresh, the wounds raw. We'd been together for almost 3 years, and I thought she was the one. But in the end, the pressures of grad school, the distance, and our diverging paths were too much. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, more of a slow unraveling that left me feeling hollow inside. That's why I decided to take the scenic route home, to clear my head and maybe find some peace in the solitude of the mountains. The weather had been unpredictable all day, with intermittent rain showers and gusts of wind that made the drive more challenging than usual. By the time I reached the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the sky had turned a deep, ominous gray, and the first drops of a new storm began to spatter against my windshield. I remember glancing at the clock, 8:13 p.m. The darkness was closing in fast, and I still had miles to go. As the rain picked up, so did my unease. The road ahead was a twisting ribbon of asphalt, flanked by dense woods that seemed to press in on either side. My headlights cut through the gloom, but the visibility was poor, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. There was no cell signal, no radio stations coming through, just the sound of rain and the occasional groan of the wind. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A flickering neon sign just ahead, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Woodland View Motel, it read. The letters, glowing weakly in the downpour. The sight of it brought a strange mix of relief and apprehension. I hadn't planned on stopping, but the weather was worsening, and the thought of spending the night on the side of the road was less appealing by the second. I slowed the car as I approached the motel, pulling into the small gravel parking lot. The place looked as if it hadn't seen much business in years. The building itself was a single-story structure, long and low, with a row of doors that opened directly onto the lot. The wood siding was weathered and cracked, and the roof sagged in places. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie glow over the scene. I parked beside an old, rusted pickup truck that looked like it had been there since the motel first opened. There were no other cars, no sign of life at all. For a moment, I considered just driving on, but the rain was coming down in sheets now, and the thought of navigating those treacherous roads in the dark was enough to convince me to stay. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat, pulled, up my hood and made a dash for the office. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was immediately hit with the smell of stale cigarettes and mildew. The interior was dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, and the walls were lined with faded wood paneling. A small desk stood against one wall with a brass bell sitting atop it. Behind the desk, a door led to what I assumed was a back room. The place had a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, as if the air itself was weighed down by years of neglect. I rang the bell, the sharp sound echoing in the stillness. For a few moments, nothing happened. I was just about to ring it again when the door behind the desk slowly opened and a man shuffled out. He was old, ancient really, with thin, wispy white hair that barely covered his scalp. His skin was sallow and wrinkled, hanging loosely on his bones, and his eyes were milky with cataracts. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Need a room?" he rasped, his voice dry, and brittle like dead leaves crunching underfoot. "Oh yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just for the night." The old man nodded slowly, his cloudy eyes seeming to bore into me as he reached beneath the desk and pulled out a key. It was attached to a wooden fob, worn smooth by years of handling. The number 7 was carved into the wood, barely legible. "Room 7, he said, sliding the key across the desk towards me. "It's the last one down." I hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange unease settle over me. There was something about this place, about this man, that didn't feel right, but I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. It was just an old motel, nothing more. I handed over some cash, which the man took without a word, and then I headed back out into the rain. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, the door slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry. The light above the door was out, leaving the entryway shrouded in darkness. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, fumbling for the light switch. The overhead light flickered on, casting a dim, yellowish glow over the room. It was exactly what I expected, sparse and dingy. A single bed with a sagging mattress sat against one wall, covered by a thin, scratchy blanket. A small dresser with a cracked mirror stood opposite the bed, and a nightstand with a rusted lamp was tucked into the corner. The carpet was worn and stained, and the wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing patches of mold underneath. The room smelled faintly of dampness and something else, something musty and old. I set my bag down on the bed and sat beside it, running a hand through my damp hair. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, and all I wanted to do was sleep. The rain continued to pound against the roof, and the wind howled outside, making the windows rattle in their frames. I kicked off my shoes, not bothering to undress, and stretched out on the bed. The springs creaked loudly beneath me, but I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind was a whirlpool of thoughts, memories of Sarah, the breakup, the long drive, and the strange, unsettling feeling that had settled over me since I arrived at the motel. I rolled over, trying to find a comfortable position, but the bed was lumpy and uneven, and the blanket was too thin to provide any real warmth. I pulled it up to my chin and closed my eyes, willing myself to drift off. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a soft, rhythmic sound that blended with the storm outside. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was breathing, slow, deep, and steady, like someone was lying right beside me. My heart began to race, and I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The breathing was faint, but unmistakable, and it was coming from the far side of the room, near the door. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things, that it was the wind or the creaking of the old building. But the sound persisted, soft and steady, like someone or something was there with me in the room. I sat up slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and looked towards the door. The room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulb, but I could see the outline of the door clearly. It was closed just as I had left it. But the breathing, it was still there, still coming from the same spot. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the switch. The lamp flickered to life, casting a pale circle of light across the room, but there was nothing there. No one. Nothing. Just the old worn furniture and the peeling wallpaper. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself I was being ridiculous. There was no one in the room but me. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, a combination of exhaustion and the unsettling atmosphere of the motel. I was fine. I just needed to sleep. But even as I lay back down, pulling the blanket tightly around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The breathing had stopped, but the room felt wrong somehow, as if the air itself was charged with some unseen presence. I closed my eyes, trying to ignore the feeling, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But then I felt it. A cold, clammy sensation, like someone's breath against the back of my neck. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest, and spun around, but the room was empty. There was no one there, no one who could have been that close to me. I stared at the spot where I had felt the breath, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The lamp flickered, casting long dancing shadows across the walls, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a shape, a figure standing just outside the circle of light. But when I looked again, it was gone, leaving only the faint outline of the door. Panic set in. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my duffel bag and swung my legs over the side of the bed, my hands shaking as I tried to pull on my shoes. I needed to leave, to get away from this place. But as I reached for the door, I heard it again, a soft whisper so faint I could barely make out the words, "Don't go." The voice was soft, almost pleading, and it sent a wave of terror through me. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob, my mind screaming at me to run. But something held me in place, some primal fear that I couldn't shake. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, standing in the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the lamp's light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could see its eyes, pale and glowing like two dim lights in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The figure stood there, watching me, its breathing slow and steady, in perfect sync with my own. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, and my legs began to tremble. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The figure didn't answer, didn't move, it just stood there watching, waiting. And then slowly it began to move towards me, its footsteps silent on the worn carpet. I backed away, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The door was right behind me, but I couldn't reach it, couldn't bring myself to turn my back on whatever this thing was. It stopped just a few feet away, its pale eyes locked onto mine. I could see its face now, or what was left of it, hollow and gaunt, with skin stretched tight over bone. Its mouth opened, and I heard that same whisper, that same pleading voice. "I'm so lonely." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and I finally found the strength to move. I yanked the door open and bolted, running as fast as I could out into the storm. The rain hit me like a wall, cold and relentless, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my feet pounding against the gravel as I fled from the motel, from that thing. I didn't stop until I was back at my car, my chest heaving, my clothes soaked through. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. Finally, I managed to get inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I sat there for a moment, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. I had seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. And now it was burned into my mind, a memory that I knew I would never be able to escape. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, the tires skidding on the wet gravel. I didn't look back, didn't want to see if that figure was still there, watching me leave. I just drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I had no idea where I was going, just away, as far away as I could get. It wasn't until I reached the main road, miles away from the motel, that I finally began to calm down. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the storm clouds were beginning to break up, revealing patches of clear sky overhead. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart still racing, and took a deep breath. What the hell had I just seen? Was it real? Or was it just a hallucination, brought on by stress and exhaustion? I didn't know. All I knew was that I never wanted to go back to that place, never wanted to see that figure again. I drove the rest of the way to Blacksburg in a daze, my mind replaying the events of that night over and over again. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the world. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. It was like a shadow that followed me everywhere, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the darkness to return. For weeks I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, heard that soft, pleading voice. The nightmares were relentless, and I found myself avoiding the dark, keeping every light in my apartment on at all hours. I even started sleeping with the television on, just to drown out the silence. But it didn't help. The fear was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I became paranoid, jumping at every sound, every shadow. My grades started to slip, and I withdrew from my friends, isolating myself in a desperate attempt to escape the terror that had taken hold of my life. And then, one night, it happened again. I was lying in bed, the television casting a soft glow over the room when I heard it, that soft, steady breathing. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, my eyes wide with fear. The room was empty, just as it had been before, but I knew what I had heard. I turned on every light in the apartment, pacing back and forth, my mind racing. I couldn't stay there, couldn't let it find me again. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to outrun the fear. But it was no use. The nightmares followed me wherever I went, and the breathing, that cold, clammy sensation, it was always there, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew I couldn't keep running. Whatever it was a part of me now, a shadow that would follow me for the rest of my life. I don't know why it chose me, why it latched onto me, but I know one thing for sure: I can never escape it. So, if you ever find yourself driving through the back roads of Virginia, and you see a flickering neon sign that says, Woodland View Motel, keep driving. Don't stop, no matter how tired you are, no matter how desperate you feel, because once you step into that room, once you hear that breathing in the dark, it will never let you go. I've come to accept that now. I know that no matter where I go, no matter what I do, it will always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the darkness to fall. And when it does, I'll hear it. The soft, steady breathing, the cold breath against my neck, the whisper that haunts my every waking moment. I'm so lonely. And maybe, just maybe, one day I'll stop running. Maybe I'll finally give in, let it take me, let it pull me into the darkness where it waits. Maybe then, the fear will finally end. But until that day comes, I'll keep moving, keep running, keep fighting to stay in the light. Because as long as I can see it, as long as I can hold on to the warmth and the brightness, I know I'll be safe. But the darkness is always there waiting, and one day it will catch up to me. And when it does, I'll be ready. At least that's what I tell myself. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now you're going to hear the story of the dangerous convict. It was supposed to be just another quiet night at the motel. That's what I kept telling myself as I sat behind the desk, the flickering light of the old TV casting a dull glow over the worn-out lobby. The Mountain Rest Motel wasn't exactly the Ritz, but it was a job, and for a guy like me, fresh out of community college and with no real plans, it was enough. I was the night clerk, the one who made sure everything ran smoothly while the rest of the world slept. Most nights it was just me, a cup of bad coffee, and the occasional weary traveler looking for a cheap place to crash. But that night, things were different. I remember it was a Wednesday, the middle of the week when nothing ever happens. The weather had turned, the sky outside a swirling mass of dark clouds threatening rain. I had the news on in the background, not really paying attention, just something to fill the silence. The usual headlines: politicians arguing, celebrities making fools of themselves, nothing out of the ordinary. But then the news anchor's tone shifted, something that caught my attention. I glanced at the screen just in time to see the words "breaking news" flash across the bottom. They were talking about a prison escape, somewhere upstate, a few hours from where the motel was located. I didn't catch all the details at first, just that a dangerous convict had escaped from a psychiatric facility and was believed to be heading south. Great, I muttered to myself, leaning back in my chair. Just what we need. A lunatic on the loose. I should have paid more attention. I should have taken it more seriously, but at that moment it was just another piece of bad news in a world full of it. Instead, I focused on the more immediate concerns, whether to order a pizza or just settle for the leftover sandwich I'd brought from home. The motel was quiet as usual. Only a few cars were parked in the lot, and most of the guests were already checked in and settled for the night. As I pondered my dinner options, the door chimed, signaling someone entering the lobby. I looked up, expecting to see a weary traveler or maybe a trucker looking for a place to rest, but what I saw instead made my blood run cold. The man who walked in was unlike anyone I'd ever seen before. He was tall and thin, almost gaunt, with wild eyes that darted around the room as if searching for something or someone. His clothes were dirty and torn, stained with what looked like blood, and his hands were trembling slightly as he approached the counter. The smell hit me before he even reached me. Sweat, dirt, and something metallic, something unmistakably like blood. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady as I forced a smile. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was trying to figure out if I was real. His lips twitched, as if he was about to say something, but then he stopped, shaking his head slightly. I could feel my heart start to race, my instincts screaming at me that something was wrong. I glanced at the phone on the counter, wondering if I should call the police, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just a guy who'd had a rough night, someone who needed help. "Are you looking for a room?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of nervousness. This time he nodded, but it was a slow, jerky movement, like he wasn't entirely in control of his own body. His gaze flicked to the key rack behind me, and then back to my face. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice hoarse like he hadn't spoken in days. "A room." I nodded, trying to keep things normal. "All right, I'll need some ID and payment. How long are you staying?" He hesitated again, his eyes narrowing. Just for tonight." I reached for the registration form, my fingers brushing the edge of the phone. I thought about dialing 911, but something stopped me. What if I was wrong? What if he was just some poor guy who'd been in an accident and needed a place to crash? I didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to overreact. "Do you have any luggage?" I asked, hoping to get him to relax, to make this whole situation feel more normal. "No," he replied. his voice barely above a whisper. I filled out the form for him, noting the way his hands twitched as he watched me. When I handed him the pen, he took it with a shaky hand, signing his name in a scrawl that was barely legible. His fingers brushed mine as he returned the pen, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I handed him the key to room 12, one of the rooms at the far end of the motel. "It's just down the hall, on the left. Do you need anything else?" He shook his head, his eyes still locked on mine. "No, just quiet." "Of course," I said, forcing another smile. "Have a good night." He turned and walked away, his movements stiff and awkward, like he was trying to hold himself together. I watched him go, the tension in my chest slowly easing as he disappeared down the hallway. But as soon as he was out of sight, the fear came rushing back. I picked up the phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the number for the local police. My mind raced. The image of the man's wild eyes burned into my memory. I didn't know for sure if he was the escaped convict, but something deep inside me told me that I couldn't ignore the possibility. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, a calm, professional voice that only made my fear worse. "County Sheriff's Office. How can I help you?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Hi, I'm the desk clerk at the Mountain Rest Motel and, well, there's a guy here who just checked in. He's acting strange. I don't know if it's anything, but with that news about the escapee..." The officer on the other end of the line went silent for a moment, then asked, "Can you describe him?" I gave them a rundown of the man's appearance, my heart pounding in my chest the whole time. I could hear the sound of typing in the background, and then the officer's voice came back, more urgent this time. "Stay where you are, lock the doors, and don't confront him. We're sending a unit to your location right now. Do not, under any circumstances, let him know you've called us." I nodded, even though the officer couldn't see me. "Okay, I'll stay here." "Good. Stay on the line with me until the officers arrive. Can you do that?" "Yeah," I said, my voice shaking. "Yeah, I can do that." As I waited, the seconds stretched into minutes, each one dragging out longer than the last. The lobby felt too quiet, too empty, and every creak of the building made me jump. I kept my eyes on the hallway, half expecting the man to reappear at any moment, but the only sound was the faint buzz of the old fluorescent lights overhead. "What's your name?" the officer asked, trying to keep me calm. "Mark," I replied, gripping the phone tighter. "Mark Benson." "All right, Mark. The officers are on their way. Just hang tight." I nodded again, but the fear in my chest was growing, making it hard to breathe. I could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with tension. I needed to do something, needed to keep my mind occupied, or I was going to lose it. I glanced at the security monitor, the small screen flickering with the grainy images from the cameras around the motel. There were only a few cameras, one in the lobby, one in the parking lot, and one in the hallway outside the rooms. I switched to the hallway feed, my heart skipping a beat as I saw the man standing outside room 12. He was just standing there, his back to the camera, staring at the door. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to get inside, just standing there like he didn't know what to do next. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. And then he reached out, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, the fear in my chest turning to ice. What was he doing? Why wasn't he going inside? My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was he waiting for something? Or someone? "Mark, are you still there?" The officer's voice crackled through the phone, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Yeah," I whispered, my eyes glued to the monitor. "He's just standing outside his room. He hasn't gone inside yet." "Okay, stay calm. The officers should be there any minute." I didn't respond, too focused on the screen to say anything. The man was still standing there, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered over the doorknob. And then slowly he turned away from the door, his eyes drifting towards the camera. My heart stopped. He was looking right at it, right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if he knew I was watching him, as if he could see through the camera and into my soul. His gaze was intense, his wild eyes locking onto the lens with a terrifying focus. And then, without warning, he started walking back down the hallway, back towards the lobby. "Mark, what's happening?" The officer's voice was more urgent now, but I couldn't find the words to respond. All I could do was watch in horror as the man approached, his footsteps echoing down the empty corridor. He was getting closer, closer with each passing second. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic, drowning out everything else. The camera showed him rounding the corner, the lobby door coming into view, and then the door burst open. I dropped the phone, my body frozen in place as the man stormed into the lobby. His eyes were wild, his hands clenched into fists as he glared at me with a fury. That made my blood run cold. "You called them, didn't you?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I was paralyzed by fear. "They're coming for me," he hissed, taking a step closer. "You think you can just hand me over like that?" I stumbled back, my hand searching for something, anything, to defend myself with. But there was nothing, nothing but empty space and the looming presence of the man before me. He was right in front of me now, his breath hot on my face, his eyes blazing with madness. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't know what they've done to me." I tried to speak, tried to reason with him, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion, my thoughts racing too fast to make sense. And then, before I could react, he lunged at me, his hands grabbing me by the collar. I tried to fight back, tried to push him away, but he was stronger than he looked, his grip like iron. "You're just like them," he growled, his voice thick with anger. "You don't care, none of you care." I could feel his fingers tightening around my throat, cutting off my air. I clawed at his hands, desperately trying to free myself, but it was no use. My vision started to blur, the edges darkening as the air was forced from my lungs. And then, just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I heard the sound of sirens, loud, piercing, and getting closer. The man froze, his grip loosening just enough for me to gasp for air. He turned his head towards the door, his eyes narrowing as the sirens grew louder, closer. The sound seemed to snap him out of whatever rage had consumed him, and he released me, shoving me away, as he backed towards the door. "They're here," he muttered, his voice low and frantic. "I can't let them take me again." I stumbled back, clutching my throat as I tried to catch my breath. The room was spinning, my heart pounding in my ears, but I could hear the sirens, the sound of tires screeching outside as the police arrived. The man glanced at me one last time, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. And then, without another word, he turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night. I collapsed against the counter, my legs too weak to hold me up. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. The lobby doors burst open again, but this time it was the police, 2 officers, guns drawn, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of the escaped convict. "Are you okay?" one of them asked, rushing to my side. I nodded, my voice too shaky to respond. I could still feel the man's grip on my throat, the terror that had consumed me in those final moments. But I was alive. Somehow, I was still alive. The officers didn't waste any time. They split up, one staying with me while the other ran out to search the grounds. I could hear the sound of more sirens approaching, backup arriving to assist in the search. The lobby was filled with activity now, officers talking into radios, the air thick with tension and urgency. As I sat there, trying to make sense of everything, I heard a commotion outside. Voices raised, shouts, the sound of running feet. I looked up just in time to see the man being dragged back into the lobby, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and despair. "They found him in the parking lot," one of the officers explained, his voice tight with anger. "He was trying to break into one of the cars." The man struggled against the officer's grip, his eyes wild as he shouted incoherently, but they quickly subdued him, forcing him into a chair as they restrained him further. The sight of him, so close and yet so far from the madness that had consumed him just moments before, sent a shiver down my spine. "What happened here?" the officer asked, turning to me with a stern expression. I took a deep breath, my voice still trembling as I recounted the events of the night. I told them everything. The man's arrival, his erratic behavior, the moment he realized I'd called the police. As I spoke, I could see the officers exchanging glances, their expressions darkening. "We've been after this guy for hours," one of them said, shaking his head. "He escaped from a high-security psychiatric facility upstate. Dangerous as hell." My stomach twisted at the thought. I'd come face to face with an escaped convict, someone capable of who knows what, and I'd been powerless to stop him. As the officers led the man out of the lobby, his eyes locked onto mine one last time. There was something in his gaze, something that chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just madness, but something deeper, something darker. It was as if he knew something I didn't, something that would haunt me long after he was gone. "Mark," one of the officers asked, pulling me out of my thoughts, "are you sure you're okay? Do you need medical attention?" I shook my head, still trying to process everything. I'm fine. Just shaken up, I guess." "Understandable," the officer replied, his tone softening. "You did the right thing calling us. Who knows what could have happened if you hadn't?" I nodded, but the reassurance did little to ease the fear that still gripped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that there was more to this than just a random encounter with an escaped convict. And then, just as the officers were about to leave, one of the radios crackled to life. The voice on the other end was urgent, almost frantic. "We've got a situation in the parking lot. We need backup immediately." The officers exchanged a look, their expressions growing even more serious. Without a word, they rushed out of the lobby, leaving me alone in the suddenly silent room. My heart pounded as I stood up, my legs still shaky as I made my way to the door. I stepped outside, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. The parking lot was lit by the flashing lights of the police cars, casting long shadows across the ground. And then I saw it. At the far end of the lot, near the edge of the woods, were two bodies, bloody and lifeless, sprawled on the ground. I felt a wave of nausea rise up in my throat, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The officers were already there, crouching beside the bodies, their faces grim. One of them looked up, meeting my gaze from across the lot, and the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. The man, the escaped convict, had killed them. It all made sense now. The blood on his clothes, the wild look in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He had murdered those people, perhaps a couple who had stopped for the night, and had come to the motel trying to hide, trying to escape. And I had almost become his next victim. As the realization sank in, I felt the ground sway beneath me, my vision blurring as the shock took hold. I stumbled back, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the pavement, my mind reeling. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the back of an ambulance, a blanket draped over my shoulders, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The police were still there, the scene cordoned off with yellow tape, their voices a distant murmur as they worked to piece together what had happened. But I didn't need to hear the details. I knew the truth, and it was something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. That night, I came face to face with pure evil, a man driven to madness by whatever horrors had shaped him, a man who had taken lives without a second thought, and I had been powerless to stop him. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in around me. I think about those poor souls who lost their lives, about the man who brought death with him wherever he went, and I think about how close I came to being his next victim. I've moved on since then, tried to put the pieces of my life back together. But the fear never really goes away. It lingers in the back of my mind, a constant reminder that there's darkness out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And sometimes when I'm alone in the quiet of the night, I can still feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.